Blood tastes like rusted iron and regret. Arthur hadn't tasted it in over 40 years. He was just trying to buy a tin of instant coffee in a harsh, fluorescent-lit convenience store. 3 bored kids saw a shaking, fragile target. They didn't see the violence buried underneath his skin. The linoleum floor of the Quick Mart held a sticky, permanent resistance, clinging to the soles of Arthur's orthotic shoes with every shuffling step. It was 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday. The city outside was drenched in a cold, unforgiving November rain, the kind that seeped through layers of clothing and settled deep into the marrow. Arthur was 72. His marrow was already cold enough. He stood near the back of the store, staring at the instant coffee. The overhead fluorescent tubes emitted a constant, high-pitched buzz that vibrated against his eardrums, a sound that always made his teeth ache. He reached up, his hand trembling with a pronounced, rhythmic tremor, to grasp the red plastic tin of Folgers. His knuckles were swollen, mapped with prominent blue veins, and the faint, silvery scars of a lifetime he rarely spoke of. The arthritis in his right shoulder flared a grinding, hot sensation, like crushed glass rubbed between the joints. He winced, pulling the tin to his chest, and leaned his weight heavily onto his wooden cane. He smelled of peppermint lozenges, damp wool from his surplus olive-drab jacket, and the distinct, dusty scent of a man who lived entirely alone. He didn't want to be here. He wanted to be back in his armchair, wrapped in silence, watching the rain streak the street lamps through his apartment window. But the coffee was gone, and the silence had grown too loud. Sometimes, an old man just needed the mundane transaction of a late-night purchase to anchor himself to the world of the living. He made his way to the front counter, his cane rhythmically tapping the floor. Click, drag, squeak, click, drag, squeak. Toby, the night cashier, barely looked up from the glow of his smartphone. Toby was perhaps 19, pale, with a chronic slouch and a name tag that hung crookedly on a faded red polo shirt. The store smelled overwhelmingly of pine sol and old hot dog grease. Arthur placed the coffee tin on the counter alongside a single, bruised apple and a roll of chalky antacids. He reached into his pocket, his shaking fingers fumbling with a worn leather wallet, trying to extract a crumpled $10 bill. Then, the bell above the glass door violently jingled. A gust of wet, freezing air rushed into the stagnant warmth of the store, carrying with it the smell of wet asphalt, cheap beer, and the cloying, synthetic sweetness of blue raspberry vape juice. Arthur didn't need to turn around to know the trouble had walked in. He could feel it in the sudden shift of the room's atmospheric pressure. He could hear it in the heavy, uncoordinated thud of wet sneakers and the loud, aggressively projected voices that filled the cramped space. 3 of them. "Man, this place smells like a dead rat," one voice declared, a wet, nasal sound followed by a sharp cough. Arthur kept his eyes fixed on the scratched laminate of the counter. Just pay. Just take the change. Just walk out. He willed his hands to stop shaking, which, of course, only made them shake harder. The $10 bill fluttered in his grip like a trapped moth. They drifted down the aisles, knocking a bag of chips to the floor. Toby the cashier shrank backward, pressing himself against the cigarette display, his eyes darting toward the security camera monitor. The kids were in their early 20s, restless and damp. The tallest one, Cole, wore a sodden gray hoodie pulled over a patchy, unkempt beard. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, but searching for amusement. Beside him was Jax, shorter, wired, chewing aggressively on a thumbnail, wearing an expensive puffer jacket that was slick with rain. The third, Braden, was the loudest. He blew a thick, noxious cloud of blue vapor into the air, laughing as it rolled over the rack of air fresheners. They weren't hardened criminals. They weren't cartel hitmen or cinematic villains. They were just bored, drunk, stupid kids. And to Arthur, that made them infinitely more dangerous. Stupidity had a momentum that malice often lacked. "Hey, register monkey," Braden snapped at Toby, leaning over the candy display. "Get me a pack of menthols. And don't bother checking my ID unless you want to eat this counter." Toby swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He reached up for the cigarettes with trembling hands. Arthur finally managed to slide his $10 across the counter. "Just the coffee and the apple, son," Arthur murmured, his voice sounding thin and reedy, a rusty hinge in the quiet store. He hated how weak he sounded. He hated the frailty in his own throat. Cole turned, noticing Arthur for the first time. His glassy eyes drifted down the olive drab jacket, down to the trembling hands, down to the wooden cane. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. He nudged Jax. "Yo," Cole said, stepping closer. The smell of sour beer rolled off him in waves. "Look at this fossil. You lost, Grandpa?" Nursing home curfew was 3 hours ago. Arthur didn't look up. He kept his gaze locked on Toby's terrified face. "Give me the change, Toby." "Let me leave. Keep the change," Arthur whispered, reaching for the plastic bag Toby was shakily trying to open. But Jack stepped directly into Arthur's peripheral vision, leaning his face in close. The skin around Jax's eyes was flushed and damp. "He asked you a question, old man? You deaf? Or just stupid?" Arthur tightened his grip on his cane. The handle was worn completely smooth from years of leaning his broken weight upon it. His heart began to accelerate. It wasn't the steady, powerful thrum of a warrior preparing for battle. It was the terrifying, erratic fluttering of a 72-year-old muscle fighting against calcified arteries. A cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck. He didn't want this. He felt a deep, hollow pit of fear in his stomach, fear of falling, fear of a broken hip, fear of dying on a dirty linoleum floor over a $10 transaction. "I just want to go home," Arthur said quietly, looking up. His pale blue eyes met Cole's. They were watery, framed by deep, exhausted creases. He offered them a fragile, placating smile. The smile of the weak. "It's late. Let an old man get his rest." Braden laughed, a sharp, barking sound. He blew another cloud of vapor, this time directly into Arthur's face. The sweet, chemical strawberry taste coated the back of Arthur's throat, making him gag. "Look at him vibrating," Braden mocked, pointing a finger at Arthur's trembling left hand. "What's the matter, Pops? You scared? You gonna pee your depends?" The indignity of it burned. Arthur felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He was humiliated. He was tired. And beneath the humiliation, beneath the thick, suffocating layers of arthritis and age and fear, a very old, very dark door began to rattle on its hinges. "Excuse me," Arthur said. The tremor in his hand was violently severe now. He reached for his plastic bag, his fingers brushing the plastic loops. Cole slammed his heavy hand down onto the counter, pinning the bag. The impact made Toby jump backward, knocking a row of lighter fluid cans to the floor with a clatter. "You didn't say please," Cole whispered, leaning in so close that Arthur could see the pores on his nose, could smell the rotting plaque on his back teeth. "Please," Arthur said. The word tasted like ash. It was a surrender, a desperate plea from a body that knew it could not withstand a beating. He was betraying himself to survive, just like he had promised his late wife he would. "Walk away, Artie. Just walk away." "Nah," Jax sneered, circling behind Arthur. Arthur could hear the squeak of Jax's expensive sneakers on the wet floor. He was now boxed in. The counter to his front, Cole to his left, Jax behind him, and Braden to his right. The claustrophobia was sudden and absolute. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow into a deafening roar. "I think the old man needs to pay a toll," Braden said, reaching out. With a sudden, jerky movement, Braden flicked Arthur hard on the earlobe. It was an incredibly childish gesture, but the disrespect was profound. It stung sharply. Arthur flinched, pulling his shoulders up around his neck like a startled turtle. "Don't," he rasped, his voice cracking entirely. "Please, boys, I've got bad knees. Don't push me." "Oh, he's got bad knees," Cole mocked, throwing his hands up in faux terror. "Jax, watch out. His knees are bad." Jax laughed from behind him. Suddenly, Arthur felt a sharp yank. Jax had grabbed the wooden shaft of Arthur's cane and pulled backward. It wasn't a hard pull, but it didn't need to be. Arthur relied on that cane to offset the ruined cartilage in his left leg. The sudden loss of his third point of contact sent him pitching violently backward. His bad knee buckled, a white-hot spike of agony shooting from his kneecap straight up into his lower spine. He cried out a pathetic, reedy gasp and crashed heavily into the metal rack holding the Hostess cupcakes. Cellophane wrappers crinkled loudly as Arthur hit the floor. Dust motes danced in the harsh light. Pain, blinding and nauseating, bloomed in his hip. He lay there for a second, staring up at the water-stained ceiling tiles, gasping for breath. His chest heaved. His heart hammered so fast it felt like a single, continuous vibration against his ribs. He thought, quite lucidly, that he might be having a heart attack. The three kids stood over him, laughing. "Oh, man down! Man down!" Braden cackled, clutching his stomach. Cole stepped forward and kicked Arthur's tin of coffee. It skittered across the floor, the red lid popping off, spilling brown granules across the filthy linoleum like coarse sand. "Oops," Cole said, grinning down at him. Arthur looked at the spilled coffee. He looked at his empty, trembling hands. He felt the cold dampness of the floor seeping through his trousers. He felt pathetic. He felt entirely broken. And then, the door in his mind finally gave way. It wasn't a heroic awakening. There was no soaring internal music, no sudden influx of youthful vigor. It felt like a disease waking up in his blood. It was cold, mechanical, and entirely devoid of emotion. The old man who was afraid of a broken hip vanished, swallowed whole by an apex muscle memory that had been drilled into his neurological pathways in places that no longer existed on maps. He didn't feel anger. He felt a terrifying, blank efficiency. Jax, still holding the wooden cane, stepped closer, leaning down to poke Arthur in the ribs with it. "Get up, Grandpa. You're ruining the floor." 1. Arthur didn't try to stand. Standing took too long. From his seated position on the floor, his right hand shot out like a striking snake. The tremor was gone. His swollen, arthritic knuckles clamped viciously onto Jax's ankle, with a violent, twisting jerk that tore a muscle in Arthur's own shoulder. He yanked the leg outward. Jax didn't even have time to yell. His supporting leg vanished, and he slammed face first into the edge of the laminate counter. The sound was a sickening, hollow times, thwack times of bone on dense wood. Jax crumpled to the floor like a dropped puppet, blood immediately pooling from a shattered nose, completely unconscious. 2. Before Jax had even fully hit the tiles, Arthur used the momentum of the pull to roll onto his good knee. He snatched his wooden cane from the falling boy's grip. Braden, standing to Arthur's right, froze. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of sudden, uncomprehending shock. The vape pen slipped from his fingers. Arthur didn't give him time to process. Pushing off his good leg, ignoring the agonizing scream of his lower back, Arthur drove the heavy rubber tip of the cane directly downward, stamping it with his full body weight into the delicate arch of Braden's foot. Bones crunched audibly. Braden shrieked, his mouth flying open in agony, his head dropping forward as he instinctively reached for his crushed foot. 3. As Braden's head dropped, Arthur brought the heavy, brass-capped handle of the cane straight up in a vicious, tearing arc. It caught Braden directly under the chin. The impact snapped the boy's jaw shut with a horrifying clack of teeth. Braden's eyes rolled back into his head, and he dropped like a stone, hitting the linoleum with a heavy, boneless thud. 4. Cole, the tallest, finally reacted, his face contorted in rage and panic. He lunged at Arthur, swinging a wild, looping right hook aimed at the old man's head. It was a street brawler's punch, telegraphed, sloppy, carrying too much weight forward. 40 years ago, Arthur would have slipped outside it, trapped the arm, and broken the elbow. Tonight, his body was simply too slow. Arthur didn't try to block. He couldn't. Instead, he simply tucked his chin, tightened his neck muscles, and stepped inside the arc of the swing. Cole's heavy knuckles glanced off the side of Arthur's forehead. The impact was explosive. A flash of white light exploded behind Arthur's eyes, and skin tore open above his left eyebrow, blood instantly blinding him in that eye. 5. But stepping inside put Arthur exactly where he needed to be. As Cole's momentum carried him forward, off balance from the missed power punch, Arthur dropped his cane, grabbed a fistful of Cole's heavy, damp hoodie, and pivoted. Using every ounce of leverage he could muster, Arthur threw his hips backward and pulled violently. He didn't throw Cole. He simply guided the heavy, stumbling kid into the path of least resistance. Cole pitched forward, arms windmilling, unable to stop his own mass. He crashed headfirst into the refrigerated glass door of the beer cooler. The thick, double-paned glass held for a fraction of a second before spider webbing and completely blowing out. Cole tumbled into the shelves in an avalanche of shattered safety glass and exploding aluminum cans of cheap lager. He thrashed for a second, groaned weakly, and went entirely still, tangled in metal shelving and dripping beer. Silence slammed back into the convenience store, broken only by the steady fizz of punctured beer cans and the rhythmic buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. Exactly 5 seconds had passed since Jax had told him to get up. Arthur stood there, swaying heavily, the blank, mechanical coldness in his mind abruptly shattered, leaving him stranded back in his 72-year-old body. The adrenaline receding felt like a physical crash. Agony spiked through him from a dozen different places. His torn shoulder screamed. His bad knee throbbed with a sickly, hot rhythm. He reached up, his hand shaking uncontrollably once more, and touched his forehead. His fingers came away slick with dark, thick blood. The metallic copper smell of it filled his nostrils, drowning out the pine cleaner and the stale beer. He looked down at his own hands, horrified. He looked at the 3 boys scattered across the floor, groaning in pools of glass and blood. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of nausea. He dropped to his knees, leaning heavily on the floor, and vomited bile onto the linoleum. He was just a frail old man again, and he was terrified of what he had just done. The sour acidity of vomit lingered heavily on Arthur's tongue, completely masking the faint, dusty peppermint he usually carried with him. He spat a thick glob of saliva onto the linoleum, panting, staring at the swirling patterns in the dirty floor tiles. His chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow hitches. The adrenaline was draining out of him, like bathwater, circling a drain, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. He needed to get up. The longer he stayed on the floor, the harder it would be to convince his joints to move again. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand, finding the smooth wooden shaft of his cane resting near Braden's unmoving thigh. He gripped it, his knuckles, slick with his own blood, slipped against the polished wood. He adjusted his grip, grinding his teeth together, and forced his weight onto his right leg. A sharp, electric wire of agony snapped through his lower back. He groaned a wet, pathetic sound and dragged himself upright. The Quick Mart was completely silent, save for the mechanical hum of the refrigeration units and the rhythmic dripping of cheap beer from the shattered cooler door. Cole was a crumpled heap of gray fabric and glass shards, unconscious, a dark, viscous pool slowly spreading from under his shoulder, mixing with the pale yellow lager on the floor. Jax was curled into a tight fetal position near the counter, clutching his ruined face, blowing bloody bubbles from his nose with every ragged, wet breath. Braden hadn't moved at all. His jaw hung at a sickening, unnatural angle. Arthur leaned entirely on his cane. His knees shook so violently he thought they might shatter from the vibration alone. He reached up with the back of his left sleeve and wiped the blood from his eye. It smeared across his vision, turning the harsh white glare of the fluorescent lights into a hazy, pinkish smear. He looked toward the register. Toby was backed into the furthest corner of the counter space, pressed flat against the rack of cheap cigars and lottery tickets. The kid had both hands raised near his chest, his fingers splayed, his eyes blown wide with an animal, primal terror. He was hyperventilating, his chest jerking under the faded red polo shirt. Arthur looked at the boy. He recognized that specific brand of terror. He had seen it decades ago, in the dense, humid foliage of a place half a world away, mirrored in the eyes of young men who suddenly realized they were not in a movie, but a slaughterhouse. Toby wasn't afraid of the three thugs on the floor. Toby was terrified of Arthur. Arthur felt a heavy, crushing weight settle in his chest, a sadness so profound it threatened to suffocate him. He had spent 40 years burying the man who could do things like this. 40 years of gentle smiles, of holding doors, of feeding stale bread to park pigeons, trying to prove to the world and to his late wife Helen that he was just a man, just a quiet, frail man. 5 seconds. That was all it took to dig the monster back up. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered. His voice was a ruined rasp. Toby flinched violently at the sound of the old man's voice, turning his face away, bracing for a blow. Arthur closed his eyes. The shame burned hotter than the cut on his forehead. "I didn't want to," Arthur said, talking more to himself than to the cashier. "I just wanted the coffee." He slowly dragged his feet forward. Click, drag, squeak. Each movement was a negotiation with agonizing pain. He stopped at the counter. The $10 bill still sat there, crumpled, near a puddle of spilled lighter fluid. The plastic tin of Folgers was on the floor, cracked open, the brown granules soaking up the wet footprints the boys had tracked in. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a $2 bill. He placed it carefully on top of the 10, smoothing it out with shaking, blood-stained fingers. "Call an ambulance, son, Arthur said quietly, looking at Toby's shoes. "Tell them there was a fight. Tell them the truth." The cameras caught it. Toby didn't speak. He just offered a jerky, terrified nod. Arthur turned away. He didn't look at the bodies on the floor. He didn't want to see the damage. He pulled his olive drab jacket tighter around his thin frame, burying his chin into the collar. He walked toward the glass doors, leaning heavily on the wooden cane, a stooped, broken figure, leaving a war zone he never asked to be a part of. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as he pushed it open. The cold, driving rain hit him instantly, a wall of freezing water that soaked through his thin hair and stung the open laceration above his eyebrow. He welcomed it. The icy shock numbed the throbbing in his head, even as it caused his arthritic shoulder to seize up with a dull, grinding ache. The city streets were empty, gleaming black under the amber glow of the streetlights. The smell of wet asphalt and rotting autumn leaves filled his lungs, flushing out the cloying scent of blue raspberry vape juice and spilled blood. Arthur began the walk home. It was only 4 blocks, but tonight it felt like crossing a continent. Every step was a calculated risk. His bad knee, the one that had buckled under Jax's pull, felt loose and unstable, grinding bone on bone. He dragged his left leg, leaning almost all of his 72 years onto the smooth handle of the cane. Click, drag, splash. The adrenaline crash was absolute. His body, pushed beyond its frail limits for 5 frantic seconds, was now completely rebelling. His vision swam. A heavy, dark nausea rolled in his stomach. He had to stop twice, leaning against a cold brick wall, gasping for air, waiting for the world to stop spinning. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like a vigilante who had dispensed street justice. He felt dirty. He thought of Helen. She had always hated the stillness in him. When they first met, shortly after he returned from the service, she had told him his eyes looked like boarded-up windows. She had spent a lifetime patiently prying the boards off, coaxing the gentle man out from beneath the trauma. "You aren't a weapon, Artie," she used to whisper to him in the dark, when the nightmares made him thrash and sweat. "You're just a man. Let it go." He had promised her, at her hospital bed, holding her frail, cold hand as the cancer finally took her. He had promised to never let the dark out again, to be the gentle old man she had built. The rain washed the blood from his face, sending thin, pink rivulets down his wrinkled cheeks, dripping off his chin onto his jacket. He had broken the promise. He had protected his own bones, but he had shattered the illusion he had spent 40 years maintaining. He reached his apartment building, a squat, tired brick structure, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a boarded-up diner. He fumbled with his heavy brass keys, dropping them twice before managing to slot the deadbolt. The hallway inside smelled of boiled cabbage, damp carpet, and the heavy, dusty scent of isolation. He climbed the 2 flights of stairs to his apartment. It took him 10 minutes. He pulled himself up by the banister, using entirely upper body strength he barely possessed, dragging his useless legs up 1 step at a time. By the time he reached his door, he was weeping. Silent, exhausted tears that mixed with the rainwater on his face. He locked the door behind him and didn't turn on the lights. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. He shuffled into the small bathroom and pulled the string for the overhead light. The harsh, yellow bulb flickered to life. Arthur looked at himself in the mirror. His face was pale, almost gray. The skin hung loose off his cheekbones. The cut above his eye was deep, the edges ragged, blood still welling sluggishly from the center. He looked pathetic, an old, beaten dog. But then he looked at his eyes. Beneath the watery, roomy film of age, something cold and flat stared back at him. The boarded-up windows were open. The violence was awake. It was sitting there, right behind his pupils, comfortable and familiar. It had never left him. He hadn't cured it. He had only put it to sleep, and those 3 stupid kids had rung the dinner bell. Arthur turned on the faucet, soaking a washcloth in cold water. He pressed it against his forehead, wincing as the rough cotton snagged on the torn skin. The water in the sink turned a pale, watery pink. He didn't have his instant coffee. He didn't have his warm drink to anchor him to the mundane reality of his evening. He shuffled out to his living room and lowered himself into his worn, brown recliner. The fabric smelled faintly of Helen's old floral perfume, a scent permanently trapped in the upholstery. He rested his hands on his lap. They had finally stopped shaking. The tremor was completely gone. His hands were perfectly, terrifyingly still. Arthur sat in the dark, listening to the rain beat against the window pane, alone with the ghosts he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun, waiting for the police sirens that he knew were eventually coming. If this story hit you where it counts, hit that like button. We all know a quiet, frail soul who carries a lifetime of storms beneath the surface. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who appreciates a gritty, real narrative where actions have actual, heavy consequences. Drop a comment below. Did Arthur do the right thing, or did he let the monster out? Let's talk about it. See you in the next one.